and also the Multicultural Fair Committee, we would like to welcome you all to our first day of a series of week-long events in the spirit of the original Multicultural Fair that we have had over the years. Again, because of the pandemic, we have had to reroute ourselves a little bit and create some Zoom programming, but nonetheless, we've worked really hard to bring together a series of presenters, films, exhibits, performances that will be expanding our awareness of global education and raising our cultural awareness as well as students, faculty, staff, and community. Right now, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, and our guest speaker is no stranger to Schoolcraft College. We've had the privilege of working with him on a number of different initiatives and presentations with his former work at the Confucius Institute at Wayne State University, but also with the work that he has provided for us in the International Institute. So this is a really fun opportunity. John, I was telling my students before we signed on today that you are multilingual, that you speak upwards of 5 different languages, which is an incredible feat for any person. So this is exciting stuff. But please allow me to introduce Dr. John Brender, who is the director in the Office of International Programs at Wayne State University. He was the director of the former Confucius Institute from 2008 to 21. Professionally dedicated to language and cultural education, Dr. Brender has taught Spanish, Japanese, linguistics, foreign language teaching methodology, and English as a second language. He has also presented multiple lectures on cross-cultural communication in China and the US, and his research focuses on international and ethnic student identity at North American universities and American experiences abroad. Dr. Brender holds a PhD in higher adult and lifelong education from Michigan State University, an MA in Romance Linguistics from the University of Michigan, an MA in Community College Administration from Chicago State University, and a BA in Spanish from Polk College. At this point, please join me in welcoming Dr. John Brender.
Okay, thank you. I hope I can call on some people to do some reading for me, maybe save my own voice. I will, is it okay to just randomly call on some people whose names I see? Anybody have any objection?
Sure. I want to make sure that we are recording. Okay, wonderful. Sure.
Okay, so let me begin. So this is all from a book for which I have completed a manuscript called Millennial Expats in China. And so in my book, here are the chapters that will go into it. And today we're going to talk about the highlighted ones. We'll mention the participants in this study briefly, which I may have done last time, so I won't belabor that. And then we'll talk about K-12 education in China and university education. Just to kind of quickly go over the demographics, these are all millennials, so they ranged in age from 25 to 40. We had kind of an even distribution, as you can say. In terms of race, we had 20 participants, 12 were white, 2 were Hispanic, 5 were Black or African American, 1 was Asian. As you can see from the gender, we had approximately twice as many men as women, which probably reflects the expat population among North Americans in China. In terms of years in China, most were there for between 4 and 6 years, but most of them were there. We had a few people who were there for about 18 months at the absolute least. So these are people who are relatively familiar with China, some very familiar. Undergraduate majors, there was a big split between humanities majors and science majors. So we had only a few people who had majored in science, and most of the people who were there, not surprisingly, were Asian studies majors, social science majors, and humanities majors. In terms of a self-study or self-reporting, when I asked students to identify themselves on an introvert-extrovert scale, you'll see that they were all over the map. So I feel that although I had only 20 participants, which is not bad for a qualitative study, they were a pretty diverse group, and I felt that I got some good opinions. good, diverse ideas and thoughts and experiences. So remember that the views expressed here are not necessarily my own, but the views of millennial expats in China. So it is through their eyes that I am reporting, and not through the tired old eyes of an aging boomer or Gen Xer. Okay, this is a drawing that my wife did incidentally on her iPad or iPhone, and I have to admit it's kind of accurate. So now that I've thrown my participants under the bus, let's begin. All right, let's talk about Chinese K through 12 education first. And the topics that came up, and I was using grounded theory and analyzing all of the interviews, and the topics that came up, simply asking open questions about K-12 education, were a standardized curriculum, classroom structure and discipline, memorization, fierce competition, helicopter parents, inequality, and overall assessments. And we'll get to each one of these. First of all, the one thing that you need to understand about Chinese education is called the Gaokao. If you remember nothing else from today, remember this word Gaokao. It is the word for the college entrance examination, literally means high test. And this is basically life for students prior to the university and even after. Now, I am no biologist, but I thought that this chart made a little bit of sense, figuring if we look at the Gaokao is the heart, and maybe as we have veins and we have arteries and so on and so forth, everything flows in and out of the Gaokao. So going into the Gaokao, what we teach, how we teach, what we don't teach, what we study, what we don't study, all of that is determined by what is on that one very important life-determining exam. So if, for example, studying Russian or Japanese is not on the Gaokao, no one cares about it, okay? If studying, European history is not on the Gaokao, forget it, okay? But what's on the Gaokao is vital. And why is it vital? Because it determines basically your career path, which university you can get into, what major you can study, what kind of career opportunities you will have, even who you will marry. So when it comes to finding a mate, and parents, especially in China, tend to have a lot of pull, and they will sort of push for example, their children to marry somebody who is at least of equal or perhaps better status. So people are always trying to fight for that. It's very much a meritocracy. It's not to say that there are not a lot of advantages for those who have money, but to the extent that they can, they try to create sort of a fair exam that is basically the same for everyone. Now, if we just take a quick look at the admission process, for example, at a very competitive school such as the University of Chicago, where I did an internship about 20 years ago. As I said, with the Gaokao, getting into the university is like taking the ACT and having the scores mean everything. So whatever score you get on that will determine your college. Doesn't work like that so much in American universities. So just to give you an idea of what American universities look for, University of Chicago, when I was there, they would look at your GPA. They would look at the level of your coursework. Are you taking AP courses? What's the reputation of your high school? What are your ACT and SAT scores? You would have to write essays. They would rate your essay. You might have a personal interview. It might be optional. Then they would give you a score of 1 to 5, and they would have 2 people go through the entire file. Then they would take a look at your extracurricular activities and say, what club activities did this person belong to? Were they involved in sports or music or acting? Did they have special or extraordinary skills? For example, if you are an actor or an athlete or something, that might get a bit of priority. Did you receive awards? What do your letters of recommendation say? And most of all, at a place like the University of Chicago or Ivy League schools, the admissions counselors are looking for spark. Are you going to add something to the classroom? They don't want somebody who's just a boring grind and will study and get good grades. They want somebody who is motivated, who has interests, who has strong opinions, and that kind of a thing. But in China, Perhaps because of the large population, to make things fair, it's the Gaokao score. There is, I should say, some special consideration for sporting abilities and musical abilities. So there's a little bit of that consideration, but not to the extent that we generally have in the US. Okay, let's look at standardized curriculum, which is one of the first things that came up. And I'm going to ask Helen, since you're first on the list, to read, if you will. This is an observation that was provided by a student of psychology. So if you would.
Sure. I remember seeing a thought bubble data science project where they asked students over in the US and students in China, describe your country in 10 words. And over here, it was just bubbles everywhere. Some were a little bit bigger than others. Whereas in China, it was basically 15 bubbles and then little tiny ones in the backdrop. And I feel like that was kind of exactly how I viewed their education system. Everything is so regimented, and because everyone uses the same books and learns the exact same material, it definitely leads to that homogenous thinking that you kind of hear about or read about in textbooks and academic papers. It's really real.
Okay, so when you figure a large population like that is studying exactly the same thing, you know, they're learning the same things, but at the same time, they're also not learning the same things. Something to take into consideration. So this is a little bit of a slightly negative or concerning view. If you would, Catrice, can I ask you to read this?
Okay, as a matter of fact, I think of the positive side, the standardization, it really gives everyone in society a certain base level. You could talk certain facts with Chinese people like you're all on the same page because that's just standard education. You don't have to argue. The proportion of flat earth persons in China compared to the rest of the world is probably very small. And I guarantee you that, especially when you look at those persons educated from K through 12 through the system, I think that proportion of persons compared to the rest of the world is quite small.
Okay, thank you, Catrice. Appreciate
You're
that.
welcome.
So one of the observations that he's making, perhaps in light of you know, recent alternative fact developments where people seem to have very different ideas of things. We have very different news outlets. He points out that in China, there's a science-based curriculum and people learn more or less the same thing. So there's not really a huge disagreement about whether or not the coronavirus exists and so on and so forth. So I thought that was interesting. Next, let's look at classroom structure and discipline, which is something that also came up. So if I can ask Andre Morris, would you mind reading?
There's maybe something that in authoritarian culture and totalitarian, well, let's call it the authoritarian. It's not just a government that kind of controls things. There's more nuisance. You could say it's not just the government, it's the schools. It's all kind of controlled and managed by the government. The schools are part of that, but also the families now, of the course. If a child disagrees with what a father says or a child says, that child is not going to get killed per se. At least that's the hope, even in China. But it's much more from the government, the politics, and the schools, even the family. There's a tighter control on what people can do and the amount of choices that they have. I'm not saying that that's a good or bad. It's just what it is.
Okay, thank you, Andre. So simply, then, by the way, at the top, est inem est enim ist is it is what it is, right? So this particular respondent mentions that, of course, the schools are more tightly controlled, the curriculum, the discipline, because the society is like that. Okay, and another. Let's see, who do we have on the list? Connors, would you mind reading? Connors, no. Stephen.
I can read.
Okay.
Okay.
Please.
I would say a lot of Chinese people do things simply because that's just how their culture works. And I can understand that because I feel like Chinese people have a richer culture than we do, at least a longer culture. When you have literally thousands of years of documented culture and you've built off of that, then I can kind of see how it's just like, all right, everything has their neat little boxes because we spent thousands of years putting them in the boxes. And that's just how the world is. And it's like, all right, that's how it is.
Okay.
Laughs.
So a little different from how we view things here in the U.S. I mean, we are comparatively a very young culture, and we're also very homogenous. So a lot of our standards are not quite so strict as maybe in China, where things are. I don't want to say that they're very homogeneous because there really are a lot of sort of diverse people within China. But there's definitely more of an established culture than you might find in the US, and perhaps a little bit less questioning. Next, memorization. So this is actually the same participant who had been a Chinese philosophy major in Shanghai had this to say. So Stephen Berg, would you mind reading? You're muted, Stephen, I think. Stephen, I'm not hearing you.
He's having some problems with his audio. If you would like,
Okay.
John, I can read it.
Okay,
Yeah,
with
please go ahead.
Chinese,
Oh,
There
never
we go.
mind.
yeah, with Chinese, you pretty much memorize all the characters. You memorize everything and then you're set. So I think that also played into their huge workload. It's just like, all right, memorize all these books, come back, take a test on all these books. Great. All right, here's your new set. It just seemed kind of surreal, but then also kind of like, all right, I commend you for doing that because I couldn't. Laugh.
Okay. So definitely a lot of memorization involved. Obviously, with characters, there is a system to it, but nothing I could explain in less than several weeks. But there's also a tendency on memorization and sometimes rote memorization. And this is something, just an observation between the U.S. and China. And I had a student say, it's not like here in the West where people are like, oh, that's just what it is. And they go like, really? Why is it like that? Why can't it be this way? What about this way? And so on and so forth. It's like we have a different way of approaching things. So I have a quote by Ben Franklin that I think typifies the American spirit, which is, it is the first responsibility of every citizen to question authority, right? It's really part of our Constitution, the whole free speech, the democracy, everybody getting a voice and questioning all sorts of things. So in China, I don't want to say that people are robotic, that they accept everything, but there's definitely less of a tendency to respond to every edict with a question. All right. I've often realized that in America, when the boss gives you a job, your first thought is, why? What's this for? Okay. We just tend to question everything almost instinctively as Americans. Whereas with a lot of my Chinese assistants, I would give them something to do and they would just do it. Maybe they had some flack behind the scenes, but for the most part, Chinese will take an order and generally work with it. All right, fierce competition. I like this photo. When I looked at fierce competition and Googled it, came up with this. You can't get better than that for competition. All right, so can I ask Todd to read this? This came from a woman who was teaching kindergarten for a while in Wuhan.
Sure. Just my own kids in my training center where I work. I know my kids are probably busier than I am. They have swimming classes, they have math classes, they have tutoring classes, after school programs, they have piano classes. Everyone's kind of just like, oh, my kid needs to be the best.
Okay. So there is an incredible amount of competition in China from kindergarten. I mean, even in the US, a lot of people we'll say the race for Harvard begins in preschool, right? And you have to get the kids into this and that. It just might be more prevalent, however, in China for people to really, really emphasize education for their kids, because that Gaokao really is a determiner for the rest of your life. All right, studying. Caitlin, can I ask you to read this? Caitlin Ginger?
Yep. Here in China, you live in these apartment buildings. Sometimes when I look out the window, I would see another building, right? And I would just see a bunch of kids through so many windows. Everyone is just sitting at their desks, just studying, writing, something with their pen, reading something, you know? And that's not something that you really see in the States with younger kids. We do tend to have more free time after school, you know, and we have a choice of what we want to do.
Okay, so I thought that painted a fairly vivid picture, and this is the best picture I could find online to try to represent that. So, so can you imagine looking out the window and seeing all the kids just dutifully studying, a bunch of 8 and 9-year-old kids? I know it's something that's a little hard to come to my imagination sometimes. Next, helicopter parents, right? We all know about them, the parents who are hovering over everything. They question the teachers. They worry about their kids getting time to do this and time to do that. This next part, this came from a woman about 30 who is teaching kindergarten in Wuhan, and I found the old Jerry Stiller photo from Serenity Now, and I just titled it Fluency Now. Okay. Can I ask Nicole Wilshire to read this? Nicole, available? Megan?
Yeah, I can read.
Thanks.
In China, I work with kindergarten students whose parents expect them to know how to read in another language that is not their mother language. The parent doesn't even speak English, but they expect their student to be able to read and write before even American students can read and write. And I tried to explain to these parents, your child is advanced considering that he is 5, but even American students at 5 are not reading and writing as prolifically as you're hoping your child will read.
Right. So this is not uncommon to find parents who are really, really uptight about how well their children are performing. All right. Next, anybody recognize the old Vince Lombardi saying, it's winning isn't everything, it's the only thing. And below I have the typical drawing of the stereotypical Chinese tiger mom. And this one I'm going to call On Winning. So this came from a young man in his early 30s who's been in China for about 8 years. He's going to marry a Chinese national in the very near future. Can I ask, it's not here. Is it Trevor King? Can I ask you to read this?
Yeah, I can read it, no problem.
Thanks.
So I get that in China, there's just so many people. And in order to get anywhere in life in China, the parents have to put a lot of pressure on their students. They have to put a lot of pressure to be the best. That if you're going to not within the sprint, wait.
If you're not, I'm sorry.
Princental, you're going to go nowhere in life, which isn't true. Yeah, maybe you won't get the job that you want, or you won't go into school go into the school that you want, but there's always another option. There's always other avenues. You know, in China especially, there's a lot of kids that come to America or the UK or Australia for colleges or even for high school.
Okay, so these avenues are available to people who have money. It's interesting, if you go through Wuhan, you'll see a bunch of students on a field trip with tracksuits with a big maple leaf on the back, because they are going to a private Canadian high school. And a lot of the students are planning to go to Canada for their university. So those options exist for people with a lot of money, but people who are less than middle class, and there's obviously a huge percentage of people in China who don't fall in that category, really the only way to advancement to success is to go through the Chinese system. And so you have just heaps of competition throughout the country. Next, equality despite attempts to be equitable. Okay. And I should mention there's a Huco system, and I think this person does a pretty good job of describing it. So I'm just going to ask another person to read this. Is Kaylee, can you read this for me, please? Kaylee Rocker, no? Ashley Kramer?
Sure. The Huco system, that was something I was really interested in as far as the education went and just kind of the stratification. It really put into light someone's social status. It was such a noticeable social symbol of where you came from. And it was just a really good example of nepotism and what a person was born into, how it can affect your life. We read about it here, but everyone kind of fights against it. Oh, you know, you're born in the inner city or you're born in Detroit. I mean, you still had the same opportunities as everyone else. People like to kind of perpetuate that sort of myth. Most of us know it does have an effect. Whereas over there, everyone seemed to admit that the Huco system was kind of BS and definitely had a negative effect on people in the countryside, and that people who were born, say, in Beijing had a better chance of upward mobility, but no one really wanted to do anything about it. But they were very willing to talk about it and admit it. Yeah, it's kind of wrong, but that's just the way it is. Whereas over here, I think we fight against that. I thought it was kind of interesting.
Okay. Thank you. So the Huco system is basically like having a passport within a country. So if you are born in Beijing or Shanghai, you have more privileges to stay and work in Beijing or Shanghai. But if you live in the countryside in Hubei province, the chances of being able to relocate to Beijing or Shanghai are very limited because they will have it almost works like immigration in the US. You don't just let everybody in. You really have to work at getting signed off by a company or a university to have the privilege of going to these universities. So you really are stratified very much by what you're born into in China. So like I say, imagine a passport limiting you to, you know, residing within Livonia, Michigan for the rest of your life until you're able to get permission to go somewhere else. Okay. Crowded classes. This also came from a kindergarten teacher in Wuhan. So is Kevin Taylor available to read?
I am.
Thank you.
So if you're in a public high school, or you're in a public middle school, or you're in a public kindergarten in China, the volume of kids that the teacher is responsible for is going to be higher in general. The only way to manage that as a teacher is to revert to more lecture style teaching. I teach in a private kindergarten and I still have conversations constantly with teachers about how they feel they have too many kids in their class. You know, their classroom isn't designed or well planned for the number of kids that they put in the class. And the reason they're putting the number of kids in the class is because of profit. It's purely money.
Right. So here, of course, in the States, if you go to a private school, you'll be in much smaller classes and so on and so forth. It's to some extent true in China, but a lot of the private schools realize, hey, I can make a lot more money by bringing in more students. So they will generally try to make as much money as they possibly can by bringing in more and more students. And of course, having a discussion style format with 50 kids is rather difficult, whereas it's much easier with 10 or 15. So in China, they tend toward the larger classrooms, and that goes on through college. Okay, overall assessment. A lot of people dream of a happy medium. So is Gareth available to read?
Yeah, I can read.
Thanks.
I think basically China is too far to one side and the US is too far to the other side, where it's a little bit more lax and a little bit looser on the kids. You know, they still want the kids to have their childhood, and thus studies aren't the focus of a lot of families or of students in the US. It's kind of like they want to have this balance, whereas in China, I feel like the study is focus, and then if you have time, you get to have your fun and free time. So I'd like to see if I'd like to see it loosen up a little bit in China, but I'd also like to see it tighten up a little bit in the US and places like the UK, where I also have family who are teachers.
Okay. So everyone sort of thinks, wow, it'd be great to have a happy medium. But unfortunately, as long as there is that Gaokao, that college entrance exam, everything is going to be predicated on that Gaokao and how well people score. So they will push the students to get the highest imaginable score to study, and also because spaces are limited. Spaces are premium in high-ranking universities. So until the Gaokao goes and there's some other way of determining university entrance exam or determining entrance, or they build enough universities to house everyone, or excellent universities, I think competition is going to be just a fact of life in China. Okay, let's look at higher education after looking at the K-12 sector. And this is a shot of Huazhong University of Science and Technology, which is Wayne State's sister school, a place I've spent a lot of time. And so here's an outline of what we'll talk about, just so that you know that we have a map and a direction of where we're going. All right, let me present some basic facts about education in China, about higher education. So there are approximately 3,000 institutions of higher education in China and about 4,000 in the United States. I think it's probably grown somewhat in China, or continues to grow. And like the US, universities in China differ greatly in terms of their entrance requirements, the status, the prestige, and the specializations. Okay. Now, some places such as Spain, the university system is more or less the same wherever you go. Now, take this with a grain of salt, as I will mention, but there are a lot of different university rankings, and a lot of them put the US and China in, first or second in terms of who has some of the best universities in the world. And part of it is just the extremely large population of our two countries, but that's not to downplay some of the technological advancements and emphasis on education and so on of the two countries. So there's one ranking that puts China as having some of the best of the top 2,500 universities and having more than the US. However, it doesn't take long to find a differing survey. And I thought this was interesting, and I don't know what the criteria of this is, but I thought I would show this anyway. And you'll see that in terms of the top 100 universities in the world, and I think this is relatively credible, the US has 58. So when you think of places like the Ivy League schools and Stanford and MIT and Caltech and places like that, America really does have some of the most amazing institutions. China, 4 at this point. The UK, of course, we can see Oxford and Cambridge and the London School of Economics and so on and so forth. But you'll notice that the larger the field, that China starts to catch up, right? So when you take all of them into consideration, this particular survey sees China as having almost 2,600 of the best universities. And the US is 3,254, which is a bit of a reverse from the others. Like I say, you can take with a grain of salt university rankings because they have so many different criteria, but as just sort of a rule of thumb, it's not a bad thing to just sort of browse. Okay, some of the top schools in China that you might hear about. Tsinghua University in Beijing is the top university. I think the ranking is almost consistently top. It's what they have called the MIT or Caltech of China. It's a technological university located in Beijing. There's also Peking University, which is a little bit broader, like a University of Michigan kind of thing, where they have great science and math and humanities and social sciences and so on and so forth. So these are among the top 2, probably are the top 2 schools in China. In Shanghai, the top 2 schools are Shanghai Jiaotong University on the technological end and Fudan University in the humanities and social science areas. And in Wuhan, where I go a lot, in central China, our sister school, Huazhong University of Science and Technology, is a top 10 school and specializes in technology and engineering. And Wuhan University, I think, is among the top 5 schools overall in China. And so you will notice that universities tend to be in large cities, okay, which I'll mention in a minute. 96% of Chinese universities are public universities, And private schools, when you hear about a private school in China, they are generally not well regarded at all. It's sort of like if you don't get into a public university, then you'll normally go to a foreign university if you can. And if you can't get into a foreign universities, people say, well, I guess you're stuck with a private school. Now, this isn't to say that you might not get into a better graduate school if you do well in a private school, but they're generally not well regarded in China. Universities are much better funded in China. Tuition in China is about $3,300 to $9,900 on average, whereas in the US, I think we start at about $10,000 and it goes up to an average private $35,000. I think that's out of date. You'll easily pay $55,000, $60,000, $70,000 for top schools per year. A fact is that most universities in China are in large cities. The idea of a small college town like Albion or Holland or even East Lansing just is not common in China. I don't know of any. So normally if you go to a top university, it will be in a very large city. And when I say very large, I mean Wuhan has 10 million people, which is roughly the population of the state of Michigan. And it goes from there. Wuhan is not even a first-tier city, so you have plenty of cities that are in excess of 10 million. Another thing about Chinese universities is that they are all surrounded by walls and gates, and they take quite a bit of pride in having these walls and gates. The top one you will see is the Huazhong University of Science and Technology. The bottom is a very famous gate at Tsinghua University. Another fact about Chinese universities is that the government oversees the universities to some extent. Now there's a lot of difference from university to university, but generally there will be a president of a university and a general party secretary. And the general party secretary would report generally back to the prefectural office that everything is going well. And so there's sort of that oversight. How that works in reality can differ quite a bit. Sometimes the president and general party secretary will work hand in hand. Other times they will be in conflict and vie for power. The dynamics change greatly, but when you hear the general party secretary of the university, that person is very, very high ranking. He'll be driven around in a limousine and really, really a VIP. A dean of a college will have a college party secretary, and that person will supposedly write reports and perhaps report to the general party secretary to make sure that everybody is doing what is necessary. And the same with the chair of a department. There will be a department party secretary. And again, the dynamics change greatly depending on the pairing of the individuals. And I have a picture of myself with the president and with the general party secretary at Huazhong University of Science and Technology. So the general party secretary incidentally spent quite a bit of time at University of Michigan, Dearborn. So we had a bit to talk about. Okay, back to the Gaokao, right? The college entrance exam and how important all of this is. Now, if you get a score on the Gaokao, you will go shopping for a college, and whatever the score is serves as kind of a currency. So let's say that you want to go to a really good school like Tsinghua University, but you can't get into the major that you want. Well, you might have just enough points that you can study Marxism, which is the lowest ranking discipline at, I think, every university in China. Nobody wants to study Marxism, but if you really want to go to Tsinghua University and you have enough points, you might say, okay, I will settle for the Marxism department. Now, you might, with that same number of points, be able to go to a top 10 university. I think Huazhong University of Science and Technology is rated number 10, and you might be able to get into computer science, which is a more desirable thing to study. But if you wanted to study medicine, maybe a more competitive discipline, you might be able to go to Shanghai University, which ranks quite a bit down the list. So depending on what you want to study and where you want to study, you will be able to use your Gaokao score more or less as currency. All right, let's look at major selections. Now, this is something that came to me from a Chinese national who discussed the fact that finding a major is something you had to commit to before entering school, and then you really can't change it. So, May Wagner, would you mind reading? Are you available?
Yeah, I can read. Some Chinese college students do not know what their major is about before they apply for a major, or they do not know that they are not suitable for this major until they go to university.
Okay, thank you. So imagine having to determine what you want to study and then sort of being stuck there, right? You really you don't have much of a chance to get out of that major once you have decided, even before going into the university. Now, in the US, I've always said when I was an academic counselor that any freshman who tells you what they're studying is lying, right? I mean, how many of us have changed our major more once or twice or more, right? As a matter of finding a professor that we find really inspiring and so on and so forth. And that's kind of expected in the US. We expect to change the major, but not so in China. They have a certain number of spaces, they fill the spaces, and it becomes very difficult to get out of those areas. Something else that came up was campus rules and conventions. So this is again from a 30-year-old kindergarten teacher, Muhan, who used to teach at university. And most of the people, I should say, in my survey did get a master's degree or studied at a university in China. So if I can, is Mariah available to read this? Mariah Wilkerson? How about Brooke Forster?
Yeah, I can read it.
Thank you.
It says the thing that's going to come to mind is the curfew. Every college student in China is subject to a curfew. If they're not in their room after a certain time, then they better find another place to stay. And that's kind of crazy to any American college student. Any American college student that hears that would just be like, what the hell are you talking about?
Okay. Sorry to force you to swear there. This, a lot of Americans were really surprised to find out how strict the rules are. And my nephew, who is taking a master's degree class in China, would be out late, and the only way he could get back into his dormitory was either to beg someone to get in or climb the gate or something like that. And I remember a friend of mine happened to have seen or heard that my nephew was coming in late, and he sent me a message, and I said, "Oh, I guess I know where you were last night," right? From 7,000 miles away. But the curfews are just a fact of life. And if you're not in a certain time, you better find another place to stay. And the same person said this. So Brooke, if you'll just continue reading this, please.
You said you wanted me to
Yeah.
continue reading it?
Mhm.
Okay. Given the vast number of kids that are here and the great lengths that they've gone through to get to that school, there's probably not a lot of people that you'll talk to that will say, "Oh, it's horrible that the school has a curfew for the students." It's generally viewed as probably a positive thing.
Okay, thank you. So I think a lot of students who are used to the college life and so on would just be appalled at the idea of a curfew. But in China, they really don't think twice about it. So teaching and learning, some things in the classroom. One is that there is a much stronger cohort structure. So if you understand what that is, you'll be put together with a group of 30 or 50 or 100 students all studying your major, and you will take the courses, almost all of your courses together. There might be a little bit of leeway in terms of what time you take it with one structure, but you get to know a group of students really well. A lot of American colleges have turned to this particular format, mostly to maintain their students, to improve their retention rate. But there were two very different ways of looking at the academic services provided in China. And the Chinese students seemed to be very happy with it. The international students did not always feel like they were getting the best treatment, or they felt a lot of times that the academic advisors didn't know what they should do with international students. So I'm not going to bother to read this particular slide, but let's just say that the Chinese were very satisfied to be guided and say, you'll take this class then and this class at another time, and everything will be fine. More classroom hours. So generally, to graduate from an American university, you will have about 120 to 127 credit hours. In China, it's more like 160 to 180. So whereas an American might spend 16 hours a week in class, and that's a pretty full load, a lot of the Chinese students I met would spend 25 or 30 or more hours in the classroom, especially during their first 3 years. And if you study something like engineering, you would spend far more time in the classroom than if you were to study, for example, English or teaching Chinese as a second language. More transmittal teaching, meaning the sage on the stage, large lectures, and one person talking and everybody else listening and taking notes, and very rarely asking questions or rebutting. There's an emphasis on memorization in China, as we talked about, the same in university as you might find for the K-12 level. This next quote I thought was really interesting. This was from a woman who has been in the US now for 5 or 6 years. And after receiving a master's in higher educational administration, actually received in China, went to Michigan State University, and also got a degree in higher educational administration. So I really appreciated what she had to say about this. So if I can ask, is Shanjay Kamran available to read?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thanks.
I think that in general, Chinese professors focus on 1 or 2 books per course per semester. They lead the students to dig deep into the books and even require them to remember or recite the content in the books. They usually ask students what the author is talking about, why the author thinks about that, how you may relate yourself with the book content, and what you have learned from the book. The professors hold the same opinions with the author and guide the students to believe in what they learn.
Okay, thank you. So this, I think, was very different from the way I was educated, the way she was educated in this particular program, where we generally have professors offer a number of books. And the important thing is not to memorize what Max Weber says or what Erik Erikson says, but to be familiar with a number of people and to be able to make an argument regardless of which direction or what your point happens to be. The importance of American education is to have enough of a grounding that you can go into different directions and go in whichever direction you want. Whereas in China, it's like you need to know Erik Erikson, you need to know Max Weber, you need to know them thoroughly and understand exactly what they're saying, okay? So there's really a difference in terms of how they approach education. Political philosophy requirements. So there is a requirement for students to take classes that have to do with the Communist Party. Now, that being said, I should say that Chinese, I've never met a real communist China, workers of the world unite kind of communist. Most people sort of give it lip service, but they're required to go to the classes and so on. So I need another person to read who is available here. Kevin Taylor?
Of course. Chinese university administrators also put a lot of effort on party building education, sharing the party's policies with the students and implementing the government's requirements within the whole school.
All right, thank you, Kevin. So there's definitely this push that at least the lip service part of things, although in recent years, since Xi Jinping has taken power, there is a push, there's more censorship. there is a push for ideology, and a lot of professors and teachers who become members of the Chinese Communist Party have to take exams, and they'll have a phone app, and they must get a certain number of points to show that they are familiar with this policy and that. That being said, most of the Chinese professors my age sort of roll their eyes. They will not necessarily complain outright or file complaints or protest, but they'll usually just sort of go along with the status quo. The CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, I would say from my observation, is really not so ideological as it is opportunistic. Being part of the CCP allows you certain access, networking access, job interviews, things of that sort. But in terms of that old Marxist workers of the world unite kind of communism, most people in China are really bent on making money and having a better life. Next, the academic freedom. You'll hear certain things from certain media outlets that make you think that China is like a North Korea, but I would have to disagree with that vehemently, because there really is a lot of leeway to think. People are coming in and out of the country constantly. There are ideas that flow. There may be censorship, but a lot of people have VPNs, and so information is not as blocked as the top tier of government may want it to be. Can I ask someone to read this? Who has not read? Any volunteers?
I can do it.
Thank you.
We couldn't write about it, anything that doesn't fit the CCP's narrative. There's things that are completely off limits, like the Falun Gong in Tibet, and then things where they like to control the narrative, like protesting. The South China Sea, pollution, gay marriage,
Xinjiang.
democracy, freedom, and IP theft. They try to make sure that whatever controversial topic that is talked about or you mention in a paper, that you understand the party line.
Okay. So what I found is that there were certain professors who would try to toe the party line, and others who were a lot more tolerant of different thinking, or would tell you that whatever the CCP is telling you is just is really just off base. So you have a lot of different types of professors. This was something that came from a student from Michigan, from this area, who studied law in Wuhan. So let me ask Steve Berg to read this, if you would.
Steve had to sign off.
I'm sorry.
John, I can read it if
All right.
you like.
Yeah, please.
Okay. It was suggested that we would have to accept China's nonsensical claims to the South China Sea. So the threat was there, but only one teacher really pushed that. And frankly, he was one of our least favorite teachers anyway. Our favorite teacher, educated in Europe, would always encourage us to think critically and told us that the CCP frequently talked a lot of crap. I can say most teachers avoided controversial subjects. A small minority pushed the party agenda or offered insight into these complicated issues. But an equal number of professors, I would say, told us the truth. It seems that the older generations were more honest and knowledgeable than the younger generation.
Okay. So you have to realize that in China, there is, you do get different viewpoints, and you have professors who are educated in the US, educated in Europe, and so on and so forth. So whatever attempt there is to suppress some of the news or different opinions, it does not just seep in, but I think it's relatively prevalent. And the students that I meet with and that I lecture at Huazhong University of Science and Technology and other places, they are bright cookies. They're not brainwashed from what I have experienced in any way, shape, or form. Degree of difficulty. This is one of my favorite comics from the far side. I don't know how he's going to do this puzzle, but so after the entrance exam is over, this is something that a quote from a Chinese student said: the college entrance examination in China is extremely difficult because of the big population. Many teachers and parents will tell students, You can do anything you want once you get into your dream colleges. It is true. Students have much freedom once they get into the college because neither parents nor professors will push students as before. So really in China, the big study period is high school and maybe before high school, because once you get into university, I can't say that it's a free-for-all or that you don't have to study anymore, but comparatively, Chinese feel like they have so much more freedom, and it's almost relaxing compared to the kind of grueling pace that they were forced into during high school and before. Let's see. Here is another quote regarding the difficulty of universities. And this is from a student athlete from Minnesota who said, from where I was in Nanjing and Jilin both, the university level, it seems more relaxed and not so intense. So they go through all this preparation and then get there, and then it's not as high of a standard as it seems, or it's just different, okay? Next, extracurricular activities, okay? So it's not necessarily like University of Michigan football on the weekends, but there definitely are a lot of club sports, and you can see in the top middle there, I'm with at the International Fair with some of the Peruvian students. Table tennis is big, dancing is huge, and here is getting near the end, so can I get a volunteer to read about extracurricular activities?
I can read about it.
Thank you.
I feel like American universities do this too, like club fairs at the beginning and everything. I feel like club life on campus was more than I was expecting, actually. For some reason, I didn't think that was a thing. I know sports are a huge difference because they have club sports, but there is definitely not as much community around the sport as there is here. Yeah, and especially rivalry between schools. There was none of that, but there's a fair amount of interest. I think more of the clubs, their student life was on similar studies. People would get together and talk about their studies or their reading, but the professional groups and music and the arts were huge, huge. People like dance groups more than here, I would say, an emphasis on the arts. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. I've seen some dance troupes that were just absolutely amazing who've, toured here and there and so on. And they really, really take it seriously. And finally, wholesome. I mentioned in a previous lecture, I don't remember if I gave it to Schoolcraft, about men and women and the fact that they tend to be a little bit delayed in the maturation process sometimes. And so Americans tend to have a big kind of hullabalooing drinking culture in college and in fraternities and sororities and all of that sort of thing. And the Chinese college students are really a lot more wholesome, and that sort of drinking culture and all that type of thing tends to happen a little bit later, oftentimes in their 30s. So if I can ask for a volunteer to, I think this is the final one. Yes, thank you, Megan.
All right. The Chinese socializing felt very much like a script that you were following. You know, I went to the pong club and I met friends from a rousing game of ping pong. Whereas in the US, it is a lot more, it is just spontaneous. Yeah, I met friends in the US, not necessarily because I share any activities with them at the start. I just kind of met them at a party or something like that and became friends. And the Chinese don't party really. So at least the university students I was around didn't, or their concept of partying was much more like the ice cream social kind of thing. So yeah, wholesome maybe is the term.
Yeah, I'm almost struck by how wholesome some of the university students tend to be when I go to China. So that's all I have on the K-12 and university as viewed through the eyes of expat millennials. So I would be glad to take any questions. I have not looked once at my clock, and I apologize if I'm over, but I'm welcome to entertain questions if you tell me what kind of entertainment questions like.
Thank you for sharing.
Oh, most definitely.
I'm happy to field any questions that come through the chat to Dr. Brender, or if anybody would like to unmute themselves. But I would like to begin, John, if I can ask, because you talk about the college entrance exam and how this is a very big culminating point for Chinese students. You know, it's interesting because I know that other countries also have these extremely rigorous entrance exams for college. And I think about my own family members in Greece, you know, cousins who have had to go through a very similar process. The problem there was that upon, you know, getting into these universities and graduating from these very rigorous programs, because of the economy in Greece, there were no jobs to fill. So my question to you is that, you know, what is the employment rate for graduates in China, or are most of them moving beyond the national borders to seek work?
It's a great question. I think it's, well, certainly it's not as bad as Greece, but it's a little like the U.S. in the sense that it'll ebb and flow. You know, there's sometimes a dearth of teachers, and so then they try to control that on sort of a national level. If there's a shortage of teachers, they will try to open up more spots in the university. And because the students are not so free to change majors, they have a much better ability to control. Now, you know, as we know, when government tries to control things like that, they're not always right. So they're taking a big gamble. And so there have been, you know, periods where students might take a little while to take a job. But I think the employment statistics are relatively similar to the US. You know, if you go to a really high-ranking university, the chances of unemployment are much lower than if you go to a place that is somewhat less prestigious. But I don't see a lot of people having to necessarily go abroad just to get employment. There are a lot of Chinese who will study abroad or stay here, and then after they finish university will go on OPT, and some will eventually maybe get green cards and that kind of a thing. So there are those things available. But as for the, you know, chances of securing employment right away is like, I would say it's similar to the US, but I know Spain is typically like Greece in that, for example, you study to be a teacher, and then there's an exam once you finish, and you might spend 3 years living with your parents and trying to take that exam until you finally pass it.
Right, and you know, additionally, I also think about a lot of people that emigrate to Canada into the United States who come with, you know, even advanced degrees and find themselves in predicaments where the work that they're securing in North America is substandard to what their educational background is. And again, I have family members who have experienced something similar. What, you know, what has been your experience anecdotally for Chinese students who have achieved this level of academic, you know, success and then have migrated to the United States or Canada? Have they been able to match their employment opportunities with their academic background?
I think some have done fairly well, and there's always that talk of the glass ceiling for, you know, a lot of internationals who will, you know, come to the US and they may get good entry positions, but perhaps they don't, you know, make it into management. And a lot of the people who come here, especially from China, are majoring in engineering, some huge percentage, because if you're going to spend so much more money to go abroad, you really need to be in a lucrative field. So engineering and maybe business are by far the most attractive areas for Chinese. There is a concept called sea turtles, and that is a term in China used for people who will study abroad or work abroad for some time and then realize, hey, the benefits of going back to China outweigh whatever I'm getting here in the US. So there are a number of people who will work here for a number of years and say, hey, you know, I might be making a larger salary here, or maybe I'll command a bigger salary, or, you know, a better living standard by going back to China with the skills that I have now. So it is in recent years become worth people's while to go back to China and live the life there.
Thank you. Other participants in our chat, would anybody like to unmute themselves or post a question that I can field up to Dr. Brender?
I have a question real quick.
Oh, Megan, you can go ahead.
Oh, thank you. It's basically along the same lines as that. I was just curious if you know, because of the way that the majors are offered to students based on their scores, are any majors completely inundated with people, or do they have a way of kind of filtering the students into different majors so that not everybody is like testing into the same, you know, classes, or how does that work?
They usually have limits, often set by the government, based on, you know, projections of the types of jobs that are needed. So if you have, you know, a spot for 50 civil engineering majors, you will not take 51, right? So you will essentially fill your quota. And obviously the higher ranking universities have less supply and more demand, so their slots will be filled far more easily than universities maybe somewhat lower.
Okay.
Does that answer your
That
question
makes
more or
sense.
less?
So,
Yeah.
so basically, would they just kind of, if those slots were filled, would they just filter them into a different major then and just be like, well, you were suited for this one best, but this is what's available?
Yeah, it's like we can take, you know, up to so many people with this particular score. So generally, when you before you take the Gaokao, you will have counselors give you an idea of where you're likely to go. And it's just sort of like applying in the US. You'll have a safety school, like I'm sure I can get into this school, and then you'll have your dream school, right? That I hope I can get here. And then you'll have maybe a list of 3 or 5 or so many universities, and you'll say, whatever score I get, I'd like to choose this at this one, this at this one. And the government ultimately will make that decision. If you are unable, they'll say, well, we have this space for this and this for this. So you're generally limited to 3 or 4 universities and in the majors that you've already chosen.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So I probably didn't explain that very well when I said there's you can shop with your Gaokao score, because generally you make a predetermination or limit yourself to certain majors and schools before you take the Gaokao, because, for example, if you take the pre-SAT, you might have a much better idea of where you're going to score when you finally do take that test.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
So John, I know Jennifer had a question, and then we have one from the chat as well.
Okay.
Hi. So, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So the first thing I noticed, like something in the presentation that really interested me, was the idea that they can't really change their majors after they picked one.
Mm-hmm.
And so that just kind of made me wondering, like, if it was even like if it was possible to do so, and like what kind of steps a student would have to do if they really just decided that this major was them and they just had to get out of it.
Yeah, that's a good question. It is possible, but it's not likely, because chances are you have, if you started out, for example, an English major, and then you wanted to become a Spanish major or something, you, first of all, you'd have to score very highly on your exams. You would have to be among the best in your chosen field. And then you would apply, and if there's a space, they might make it available to you. But if you took some courses that did not particularly fit the slots of requirements, you might have to stay a little longer to continue. So I think what a lot of students do, and it's not terribly unlike the US, is that they will choose a different major when they go to graduate school and hope that whatever preparation have will feed into that particular major.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
John, the question from the chat is from Nancy, and it reads, what percentage of students in the population get into university, and how does that compare with the US?
Gosh, that is a really good question, and I don't have a terrific answer for it. I do know that the last Gaokao, I think, there were like 9.7 million people who took it. That is the population of Michigan, okay, taking the Gaokao. I believe that China is pretty good in terms of offering universities for most people that most people can get into, but it's a matter of getting into the prestigious universities, right? I mean, it's like getting into Harvard or something. What are the maybe 1 in 16 or something of that sort. And Tsinghua University, the the percentages probably are far less than that, 1 in 20,000. So you get into those schools and you are a rock star. It's sort of like the way we look at someone who plays basketball for a top ranking university. Those are the stars here. But if you go to Tsinghua University, people are just, will gather around you because, that's such an impressive feat.
We also got another question in the chat from Mark, and he said, what are the duties of a class monitor who sit in foreign teachers' classes at public universities in mainland China?
Who sit in, say the last part?
Who sit in foreign teachers' classes at public universities in mainland China?
I've heard of this, and so I don't have really great data on this, but I've had, for example, students who would teach college courses, and for example, they brought up a debate topic like gay marriage or something like that, and everything's fine, and all of a sudden he said, I would see a student that I'd never seen before, and they would start, spouting the party line about whatever the topic happened to be. So I think, there certainly are some people who are duty bound in that respect. And I've also heard of, for example, Chinese students who will sit in American classrooms where, for example, maybe there's a lecture on freeing Tibet or on the status of Taiwan. And there are instances where they've been known to, for example, photograph the people who happen to be at these lectures and then report them, for example, to the people at the local Chinese consulate. I don't know that that happens all the time and everywhere, but I do know that it happens. And, I don't know that necessarily somebody is sent to monitor a particular foreign teacher, but I think if they start to hear rumors, somebody will magically appear.
There is also a request to share the recording. John, would you like us to handle that from the Schoolcraft end, or would you like to be the one to have students contact you for the recording?
You're welcome to do that on the Schoolcraft end. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Are there other questions that people would like to ask Dr. Brender? Oh, here's a question. Can students with special needs be included in Gen Ed in China?
I am not an expert on this. I do have a friend who is. I could refer you to Kathy Johnson at St. Cloud State University. And she's been the director of their Confucius Institute, and her specialty is exactly that, is education for the deaf and for students with disabilities. I will say that China has certainly lagged behind the U.S. in that respect. So accommodations are not generally made for people with disabilities the way they are in the U.S.
Thank you for sharing that. Are there any other questions that people would like to ask Dr. Brender at this point? Okay, we're getting some thank you messages posted in the chat. On behalf of the Schoolcraft College International Institute, I would like to thank you for sharing your expertise and your time with us today, and for helping us kick off our Multicultural Education Week. I do encourage people to attend our events. They are all posted on the Schoolcraft College website. We have another one coming up at 3 p.m. today from the Arab American National Museum that I welcome you all to attend if you have the opportunity. My students, you are free for the rest of the day, so please enjoy the rest of your afternoon. And if any of my students have questions, please feel free to email me. And thank you again, Dr. Brender, for your time.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks to everybody.